Becky, today you're going to learn about the prompt reinforce sequence. It builds on what you already know about reinforcement.
Well, I know reinforcement involves three things: a prompting event, the learner's target behavior, and a reinforcer.
Each day there are hundreds of opportunities for you to teach clients using the prompt reinforce sequence.
Hundreds? Really?
You bet. We don't just teach when there's a formal program. Each time you give an instruction, that's an opportunity to teach the client. The more effective you are at using these casual teaching opportunities, the quicker clients progress.
What do you mean by casual teaching opportunity?
Yesterday, you tried to get Paul to go with you to work, remember?
Yeah, I couldn't even get Paul to look at me.
That was a teaching opportunity.
To teach Paul to follow my instructions.
Sure. You were prompting with verbal instructions. A prompt can also be pointing or demonstrating or physically touching a person. In the prompt reinforce sequence, we use verbal prompts first, and then verbal plus physical prompts.
So we use prompts to let a person know what target behavior we expect.
Right. When the target behavior occurs, we reinforce the person. That's the prompt reinforce sequence. Your verbal and physical prompts were ineffective, remember?
Yeah.
Let's review what happened last night.
Okay. Come on, let's go to work. Don't you want to go to work? It's time to go to work. Come on, let's go to work.
Becky, just a minute. First of all, you don't have Paul's attention. Say, Paul, look at me.
Paul, look at me.
Okay, now say, Paul, look at me, and bring his arm down and turn his head as you're saying it.
Paul, look at me.
Okay, now reinforce him.
Paul, good looking.
Okay, now get him to come with you.
Paul, come with me.
Okay, maybe you need to break your instruction down into something less complicated, like Paul, stand up. But remember to get his attention first.
All right. Paul, look at me. Paul, good looking at me. Paul, stand up. Paul, good standing. Paul, let's walk. Paul, good walking. Why were my verbal and physical prompts so ineffective?
You didn't have Paul's attention. You weren't even saying Paul's name, remember?
Come on, let's go to work. It's time to go to work. Don't you want to go to work? Come on, let's go to work.
It's impossible to get a person's cooperation if you don't have their attention. How did I ask you to get Paul's attention?
By using his name and by asking him to look at me.
Right. Saying his name and instructing him to look at you is a verbal prompt, the prompt part of the prompt reinforce sequence.
Paul, look at me. But he still didn't look.
That's why I asked you to repeat the verbal prompt and add a physical prompt. Guide him to look at you. Okay, this time as you're saying, Paul, look at me, move Paul's arm down and turn his head to look at you.
Paul, look at me.
Okay, reinforce him.
Paul, good looking at me. When I physically guided him, he looked at me, and once he looked at me, I reinforced him.
You're saying good looking at me is the reinforce part of the prompt reinforce sequence.
I tried to get Paul to come with me when I said his name, but he still wouldn't come.
Your instructions were too complicated. Paul didn't understand them. What happened when you simplified them?
Well, he responded and came with me. Paul, come with me.
Okay, maybe your instruction's too complicated. This time, say something simpler like stand up, but remember to get his attention first.
All right. Paul, look at me. Paul, good looking at me. Paul, stand up. Paul, good standing. Paul, let's walk. Paul, good walking. So the prompt reinforce sequence is to give a verbal prompt, say a person's name, and then give an instruction like, Paul, look at me, or
Right.
Paul, stand up.
Right. If you want Mary to put on her shoes, how would you prompt her?
I'd say, Mary, put on your shoes.
That's a verbal prompt, and it has two parts. First, you said Mary's name, then you gave the instruction, put on your shoes.
Just how important is saying the person's name?
Saying a person's name first helps get their attention.
I see.
You wait 3 to 5 seconds for Mary to respond, and if Mary does the target behavior, puts on her shoes, what do?
I reinforce her with, Mary, good job putting on your shoes. And if the person doesn't respond?
Well, if the person doesn't respond to just the verbal prompt, you repeat it and add a physical prompt. Physically guide the person to complete the task.
Physically guide?
Well, physical guidance means manipulating the person's body to help them do what you instructed.
So I repeat the instruction, Mary, put on your shoes, and I help Mary put her shoes on.
Right.
And I reinforce Mary even if I physically guided her.
Yes, because you want her to do it again.
This is all very structured.
We structure our teaching interactions so the client will have the best chance for success. Success is so much more pleasurable.
Okay, let's go over it again to make sure I really understand it.
Okay, let's say you'd like John to sit down. You prompt by saying the person's name and giving the instruction.
Like, John, sit down.
Then what do?
I wait 3 to 5 seconds for John to start to respond, and when he carries out the instruction, I reinforce him.
Exactamundo. What if John doesn't sit down?
I repeat the instruction, and this time I add a physical prompt. I physically guide John to sit down.
Anything else?
Oh, I reinforce him when he sits down, even if I physically guided him.
Exactly. You want him to do it again.
Is there a difference between giving an instruction and asking?
Sure is. When you ask a person to do something, it's optional. If the person doesn't do it, it's okay. When you instruct a person to do something, it's not optional. If the person doesn't do it, you plan to follow through with physical guidance to help them do it.
So I should be prepared to follow through on an instruction.
Yeah. I often see people fail to follow through on instructions, but the client still learns something. What do you think a person's learning if you don't follow through with physical guidance on an instruction?
That it's okay to ignore me?
Right. And that's one way that clients, children, spouses learn to become uncooperative. They learn to ignore you. So that means you don't prompt a person from across the room unless you're sure the person's going to follow through.
Are there other ways that I might cause people to be uncooperative?
Well, by not getting the person's attention before you give the instruction.
Like last night, I was doomed from the start.
Before you can get cooperation, you've got to get attention. That's why we say the person's name first, and then give the instruction.
I didn't realize I had to use the person's name with each instruction. Now, last night you had me tell Paul to look at me. Should I do that for everyone?
Well, for some people, just saying their name before giving an instruction is enough of an attention prompt. For others, like Paul, you need to give a separate verbal prompt to get their attention, like, Paul, look at me, or Paul, look at the materials, or Paul, look at the table. It depends on the circumstances.
Do I still wait 3 to 5 seconds for the person to start to respond?
Yes, and you reinforce them for giving their attention. If you don't get their attention, repeat the verbal prompt and add a physical prompt. Physically guide the person to look where you're directing them. Another way that we teach people to be uncooperative and ignore us is by giving overcomplicated instructions.
How can that be avoided?
Well, don't give 2 or 3 instructions together. Break instructions down into smaller steps.
Like breaking come with me into stand up and walk with me.
Exactly. Too often we confuse the client instead of helping them. Well, I'd like you to try out the prompt reinforce sequence with Curtis. It's about snack time, and I'd like you to help teach him to drink with a cup.
Okay. Curtis, look at me. Good looking at me, Curtis. Curtis, I have some juice here. Curtis, take a drink. Curtis, take a drink. Good drinking, Curtis. Good.
What were you trying to do?
I was trying to get Curtis to lift his cup.
What did you do first?
I tried to get his attention. First, I prompted by instructing, "Curtis, look at me."
Your first prompt was a verbal instruction.
I reinforced Curtis for turning his head.
What did you do next?
I tried to get him to pick up his cup.
You used verbal instructions to prompt Curtis, and you kept your instructions simple.
When Curtis didn't respond to verbal instruction in 3 to 5 seconds, I repeated the instruction and physically guided his hand.
You reinforced Curtis whenever he followed your instruction.
Even if I use physical guidance, I can see how the prompt reinforce sequence is something I'll be using all the time, whenever I need to get another person's attention and cooperation.
You'll find instructing someone less frustrating and more enjoyable if you get the person's attention first, and avoid using overcomplicated instructions. Well, that's it for today. See you next time.
Okay, Greg.